So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayard. I'm with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I'm joined by my colleague today, Jordan Johnson, who will be observing today's webinar and helping support. We are on for facilitation and technical support. So if you need anything during today's webinar, you have any questions, feel free to reach out via the chat. I just opened that up for everyone so you can participate in it if you need to. Tell us good morning or anything like that. Today's Workforce Wednesday webinar topic is transportation-related barriers impacting student access to work-based learning. And Laura is going to, from NIU, is going to, and Ed Systems, sorry, is going to tell us all about this amazing project that they've been working on and kind of the findings and next steps for the project. Before we dive into the content today, I wanted to go over some housekeeping items. So just like every other Workforce Wednesday webinar that we do, today's webinar is being recorded and will be up on our Illinois Workforce Academy website within about 48 hours. We will have a follow-up survey in an email sent out to you tomorrow. With the follow-up survey will be the link to the website where you can find the recording and this presentation slides from today. The recording typically takes about 48 working business hours to edit the closed captioning and do any other editing that we might need to do. So please allow for that time. And then we are on the Zoom webinar platform, but Laura has some engaging questions throughout her presentation. So we do encourage you to be able to unmute yourself and participate with Laura. You do not have access to your microphones. So if you would like to speak and answer any of Laura's questions live, we do welcome that participation, and you can simply raise your Zoom hand and then I will unmute you. Or you can feel free to participate via the chat or the Q&A, and Jordan and I will be happy to facilitate those questions and answers to Laura as you guys are participating today. So we hope you're fully immersed in today's session. I'm going to launch our beginning polls that we have for every Workforce Wednesday webinar. And let me just make sure I have the right ones here. So the first one is, where is your local area? So if you could just let us know if you're joining from the Chicago area, Northern Illinois, Central, Southern, or if you're statewide. And this is just for our analytics that the WEO Professional Development Committee goes over at our meetings. And in the follow-up survey, there is a question where if you have a future topic that you would like professional development on, we really want to meet the system where you guys are at. So feel free to put that in the follow-up survey, or you can reach out to me directly. I am on the planning committee, and we would be happy to pursue any future Workforce Wednesday webinar topics that you all are interested in the system. So it looks like most of you are joining us from up north today, but we have one person from down south and one person statewide. So it's good to have that span across the states. And then our other workforce webinar standard poll is, which partner do you best represent? So if you best represent Title 2, 3, 4, or another WEO partner stakeholder, or a state or local workforce innovation board member. And if you've ever joined us for a Workforce Wednesday webinar before, you've probably answered these polls a million times. So we always appreciate your participation. It's always just good to kind of gauge who our audience is. Looks like we have 3 Title I members on with us and then 1 Title II. So thank you all for participating in those polls. And I will be here if anyone needs anything via the chat. Like I said, if you want to participate and answer a question live, please feel free to raise your hand on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom, and then I can unmute you. And I'll hand it off to Laura to start her presentation.
Hey everybody, my name is Laura Monacuto, and I am a policy and program manager with Ed Systems Center at NIU. Today's presentation is going to be about some work that we have done through the Illinois Education and Career Success Network, which Ed Systems is one of the managing organizations for that network. And I'll give you a little bit of background in just a second about what exactly the Success Network is, what we call it, just kind of in the shorthand. But I'll give you a little bit of context about the Success Network. But first thing I just want to say, I'm happy to be here with all of you today. This transportation related work is still ongoing, but we've done a lot to get to the point that we're at today. And so I'm really excited to share what we have so far. A little bit about our topics. So as I mentioned, I'm going to give some background on the Success Network and its policy committee, which is where this transportation work really has been going on. A little bit about what the process of the work group has been so far and what we want it to be moving forward. And then a summary of our initial findings. We have a memo that will come out shortly, hopefully within the next week or so, that is really expanding on these things in detail. And then I'm going to talk about some of our plans for this work group moving forward before it wraps up. So first, the Success Network. For those of you who are not familiar, the Illinois Education and Career Success Network was formerly the 60 by 25 network. It was launched in 2013. Ed Systems, as I mentioned, is one of the managing organizations. We also work with ISAC and Advance Illinois to support this. But it largely functions as a network for leadership communities to partner on workforce education initiatives, and is committed to working together to develop plans and strategies to implement pathways across these communities. It's also a place where these networks come together, or these communities come together to, share best practices and ideas with each other. So really, again, with that goal of supporting communities to increase meaningful post-secondary attainment, also with an equity focus of the equitable post-secondary attainment. So with that in mind, we launched last December the Success Network Policy Committee. The goal of the Policy Committee specifically was to provide a space for these local practitioners and policy leaders to kind of come together and learn from each other. So there are a few main ways that we do that. One is with a focus on elevating local practice. So we'll bring in leadership communities, for example, to talk about some of the local practices that they are doing, with the goal of that helping to inform state policy. And then we also are, sharing policy information and supporting those practitioners to take advantage of policy windows. I mentioned the leadership community highlights are one way that we do that. We also have just continually updating the group on new and emerging education and career policy efforts. We also engage with data. One of the things that we did this past year, we had a member of our team at Ed Systems who developed a Success Network dashboard, and he shared that with the group. And then just looking at opportunities to have some of those policy conversations in an innovative way, to cover maybe some challenges that come up in the area of education and career pathways, and look at them kind of with a new curious perspective to see if potentially there are any policy changes that could be pushed for. So in the initial meetings of the policy committee, something that came up a lot was this transportation piece. Transportation, actually, I guess one more thing that I don't know if I clarified, the policy committee is made up of practitioners kind of across the P20 pipeline. So we have some folks who are working in education. We have some folks that are working in policy roles. We have some that are working in post-secondary or workforce. We have some, people who work with employers. So it's really a wide range of people. But again, what came up is transportation was one of the things that came up over and over again in those early meetings, specifically as it relates to how students are getting to work-based learning opportunities. So we decided to launch this transportation work group to really dive into that. Our particular work group is focused primarily on in-school youth and diving into access obstacles with the goal to explore creative solutions. One of the reasons we decided to do this as well is because we knew that there was other work going on in the field. We knew that there were other groups, other networks that were having these conversations. So for example, we've been coordinating even recently with the IWIB Career Pathways for Target Populations Committee. They are interested in doing some transportation related work. So one of the goals that we had was how can we coordinate with those folks to make sure that the work that we're doing is complementing each other. So that was one of the reasons that we decided to focus our work on in-school youth, was so we could kind of, cover as much ground as we can with those other folks who are interested on working to dive more into what it means to provide or have access to transportation for these work-based learning opportunities. So how did this group come together? What did we do? So we launched the group last spring in April. Between May and November, we met this group about 5 times. We really dove deeply in our first several meetings just on barriers. We wanted to really cast a broad net and make sure we were capturing, all of the different kinds of barriers that arise that can impact whether or not a student is able to participate in work-based learning that pertain to transportation and their ability to get to and from their work-based learning site. And then sort of as we approach November, we started brainstorming for potential solutions. Like I said, we have a memo of our initial findings that is in its final stages. So that will come out, within the next week or so. If you follow the Success Network, I'm sure you will see the announcement of this really imminently, pretty much. And then what we plan to do, and I'll talk more about this later, we plan to do a little bit more work before we wrap up this committee's group. So we decided initially we were going to try to be done by now, but we decided it was just too robust and there was more to do. So we are having a little bit more work on solutions. And then we also decided to conduct a survey with the goal of releasing a second memo in the spring to sort of detail and outline those pieces. So what exactly do these findings include? So this is where we're really getting into the nitty-gritty. Again, the focus for this group was on in-school youth. So after we had our wide-ranging conversations about barriers and what comes up when we talk about student access to transportation for work-based learning, there were kind of 3 main themes that we wanted to break them up into and that emerged. The first was practices that were happening at a local or district level. So these are things like public transportation or access to private transportation, things that were barriers on a more systemic level. So these are more things that might require policy change or more specific, longer term things to change. And then also just equity considerations of, if people are talking about solutions for these types of things, what does that really mean from an equity standpoint? So that was sort of how our findings came together, diving a little bit more into each one. And with all of these, really something I meant to say earlier is that there is kind of an understanding in this transportation work, and part of the reason that we are working to connect the dots with other groups who may be talking about transportation, like the IWIB CPTP group, is because often some of these barriers and challenges that we talk about are specific to in-school youth, but there are also a lot of pieces that can and often persist once folks are out of school. And so that's actually an interesting kind of piece I want to talk about with you all later, is sort of what do you think the similarities and differences are between these in-school youth and folks who are out of school. At the district and local challenges, kind of moving back to that, the 2 things kind of broke up into public transportation access and then private transportation. So the public transportation piece, really varies by region type, with the suburban communities kind of falling really in either or both of the categories. So for a lot of our rural and some of our suburban communities, there is little to no public transportation, or it's not really within the community that it's available. So in those situations, students can often be reliant on private transportation, whether that's provided by the school district, whether that's provided by the student or their family members. And then in some of our urban and suburban communities, there may be public transportation, but there are several other limiting factors. So fares could be challenging. There may not necessarily be student fares. Routes obviously are the work-based learning sites near the routes for these public transportation methods, and then schedules too, right? How do the schedules for the public transportation fit with the times that someone needs to get from one place to another? Is the employer working on a schedule that coincides with when they would be able to get there through the public transportation? For longer term work-based learning commitments, so things like career development experiences, which require 60 hours, those internships, things like that. A lot of this can add up, right? Those fares really add up over time. Even just the logistical burden of, how long it takes to get from point A to point B, if students have to switch buses or switch trains, it can be a lot. And so those pieces all together are things that can really impact whether someone may choose to participate in work-based learning. Kind of similarly, lack of access to public transportation. So if there is no public transportation and students are reliant on private transportation, that can also be really limiting. So, if someone is dependent on a personal or family vehicle and they don't have one, that can be, really, that can impact pretty solely whether or not someone is able to. Even if they do have, say, a vehicle, the cost of fuel, some of those logistical challenges. I think I put the cost benefit dilemma in the private transportation column, but I think really overall, it can be really tricky for students, right? When they're looking at, I want to participate in this work-based learning, but the transportation is a challenge. If there is, whether it's the cost of public transportation or the cost of maintaining a vehicle and fuel, they have to weigh that with what their perceived benefit of participating in the work-based learning course or experience is. And, that doesn't always, work in the favor of participating in work-based learning. Sometimes it can be a big factor in a decision not to do work-based learning. And if we're really trying to focus on, providing access and equitable opportunities for work-based learning, it's definitely an important piece to consider. Some of our systemic challenges that came up, maybe a little bit, I'm realizing now that this slide is a little bit incorrect, which is fine. I know what I wanted to talk about, but I'm seeing now that something got copied over from the previous slide accidentally. So systemic challenges that come up are ones, again, that would require more broad policy change. They relate to either state level law or administrative rules or things like that. I would say of the stuff that we have done in our work group, this category is probably the most specific to in-school youth. But I do think, I feel like even in the context, right, again, of the idea that barriers that come up for transportation for in-school youth likely and often persist after they are out of school. These are solutions or pieces that if districts can solve or find creative ways to handle, this still means that the student will likely have transportation challenges when they are out of school, right? Because the transportation would be being provided by the school district. But the ones that did come up here were related to permissible vehicle types. So for a K-12 district, state law outlines what types of vehicles they're allowed to use to transport students. And those rules are largely varying based upon two things, which is the number of students that they are transporting, and then the purpose. So whether it's curricular or non-curricular. So, if they're doing a work-based learning opportunity as part of a course, that would fall in the curricular category most of the time. Often what this really means is that districts can transport students with the traditional yellow school bus. A lot of times for these work-based learning opportunities, they're not transporting a yellow school bus full of people, right? It's usually smaller amounts of students, especially for some of our smaller communities or more rural communities. And so for those communities, using a yellow school bus is probably not the most practical option. Other options that come up are either a van. So really it has to be a van that has a certain certification, which for a van is typically going to be a 15-passenger van. And some of the challenges of finding the vehicles with the proper certifications, just with the supply chain, or districts being able to purchase those types of vehicles can be limiting. Also, there are some vehicles that districts may already have. So there's one that is called a multi-function school activity bus, which is typically a little white bus that school districts will have primarily for use for extracurricular activities. They can use those in 9 through 12 for curricular purposes, but the driver credential, which is actually the piece that's supposed to be on the right-hand side of this slide, can be a challenge. So the other challenge that comes up a lot, sort of systemically, again, for primarily in-school youth, is related to the credentials that are required for districts to be able to transport the students. So pretty much any type of vehicle that that school districts can use to transport students for curricular purposes is going to require someone to, at minimum, have what is called a school bus permit, which requires a course and some other extra steps that someone would have to go through to get that permit. From the research that we've done, it seems like one of the challenges with that can just be the availability and logistics of actually getting into the course. For some districts that are small or more rural, a lot of times the responsibility to drive these vehicles and get these credentials is placed on staff members who have other responsibilities. So it can be a little too much of a burden on some of their faculty and staff members. So that is, that driver credentialing piece is another thing that has become a challenge. And just overall, right, a lot of our K-12 school districts are dealing with a overall staffing shortage. So factoring in needing drivers who have specific credentials can be a big challenge. Sorry, I feel like I tend to talk fast. So if anyone feels like I'm going too quick, just, put something in the chat. Let me know if there's anything else you want to know. But sometimes I catch myself and I feel like I'm going quite quickly. Another thing that comes up specifically systemically is funding. A lot of our school districts are working with limited funds and identifying what of the funds they have that is usable for work-based learning transportation can be a challenge. For example, CTE Perkins funds can't be used for transportation related expenses. So that is, one example of the kinds of things where when we talk about policy being sort of a challenging factor to deal with, that is one example. We had some folks talk about using WIOA funding, but the general kind of thing that came out of that conversation was just that it can be difficult and confusing to do that. And so, that's one thing to maybe explore. But really the funding challenge, well, again, whether it's funding to purchase vehicles, whether it's funding to, help get more drivers the necessary credentials, whether it's funding to help students pay for fare on public transportation, all of those are different kinds of examples of places where funding can be a difficult thing. And then our third piece, again, I feel like I'm going too fast. Our third piece is some equity considerations. So kind of as we move forward and as folks, go in their communities and look at ways to sort of work around, or not work around, but work through some of these different challenges related to transportation for work-based learning. As folks are working through these things, they need to keep equity in mind, right? So these are a couple specific considerations related to equity and access that the group that came up in our conversations, that we really wanted to make sure folks are keeping in mind as they're sort of navigating these conversations, this work, the innovative practices. So one is just equity as it relates to compensation and cost of transportation. So one, for example, it seems like something that is fairly common, is that, if there is a place where districts are not able to provide transportation, that burden often just the only thing they can do is really have the student provide their own transportation in some cases if they're especially stuck. And that's really not fair for students, right? Because especially for students who may be from low income backgrounds, may have trouble, paying for a vehicle. We already talked about if they don't have access to a vehicle, fuel, those types of things. It really will dissuade certain students more than others from participating in work-based learning. And then kind of connected to that, right, is the idea of how are we compensating for work-based learning, right? So if a high school student is taking a work-based learning course through their school and they are only getting school credit, but they are having to provide their own transportation, that's putting a lot of the burden on the student without really the financial support to, again, pay for fares, pay for fuel, pay for insurance, whatever it may be. And it brings back that cost benefit dilemma, right? Is what they get for participating in the work-based learning experience worth the overall costs and their ability to cover transportation? Or even, if it's a low-income family, it's also might be, is it worth participating in work-based learning when they could be, spending their time on other things that will make them more money? So that's something that, as we start to talk about solutions and try to work through as much as we can about these challenges with transportation, it's something that definitely the work group wants people to keep in mind. And so we've had a little bit of preliminary conversations about what are steps that can be done to minimize the cost burden on the student. And as we move forward with solutions, we think that's really important. A couple of folks have thrown around some ideas. Again, we're not fully complete with sort of what we're planning to put out on the solutions piece, but definitely like some like brainstorming type ideas that have come up, or what are ways that employers can help students minimize the costs. So some different things like that, but really, again, just keeping that in mind as we get creative. And then sort of the other piece here is meeting diverse needs, right? So for work-based learning to truly be accessible and equitable, it should be tailored to meet students' individual needs, right? Certain students, or everybody, like different students have different needs, right? So certain students may need that in-person hands-on component more than others to really get the benefit out of work-based learning. And while folks are coming up with some creative work-based learning options, so we talked about school-based enterprises and virtual work-based learning, which are great options, they should be seen as part of a broad range of options, right? Because not all students are the same. Not all students are going to benefit from those particular contexts. It's not going to meet everybody's needs. And just the general overall reminder that kind of comes from this conversation about how do we meet diverse needs in the solutions that we're talking about is remembering and acknowledging that this transportation piece is really complex. It's a challenge that has a lot of factors. We've talked about quite a bit as we go through, and we're going to talk about a lot more, as we wrap up this work group. But there's not one cure-all solution, right? We can't just transition everything to virtual or to school-based enterprises, where students are doing their work-based learning in their school building. Those work great for some, career pathways. They work great for some students, but we need to be creative in a lot of different ways to really address this solution. And even then, there may be things that are just difficult to do. So that is kind of the summary of the initial findings of the work group. Like I said, that is really a lot of the top line items from our memo, but our memo will be coming out. Really, I want to say this, like, I don't want to be too overly promising, but it will be coming out before the end of the year. So we are very excited to share that. So a couple questions that I have, I know, we mentioned at the beginning, I do have a couple questions for you all, right? So most of our work so far is pretty specific and focused to in-school youth. We have had some ideas about employers, but curious if you have any thoughts about how we can engage employers more in this conversation, or any ideas about what role employers can have when it comes to transportation. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that, wants to put anything in the chat, wants to share. You can see I have other questions here as well, so we can move on if no one has questions about that. But these are kind of some questions that I have for all of you. Also, what do you see as similar for out of school youth versus adults? What is different when it comes to getting to and from work-based learning? And then any collaboration. I see some comments in the chat. Engage a chamber of commerce and local HR groups. So, question, kind of a follow-up, Craig. Engaging those groups, what kind of questions should we bring to them, or what should we have conversations about? Like, what would you suggest as a way to kind of bring up this conversation?
And Craig, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you if that's easier. There we go.
I was gonna joke, say, well, you're the one that asked, how can you engage employers? I was just telling you how.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious
But
if you think there are any questions that would be especially worthwhile to ask them.
I think it'd be worthwhile asking them is, have they found that as the barrier to not employing students? And are they aware of other resources that they provide to their other employees? Because here's the hard thing. As an HR person, I can't offer a benefit to, let's say, if I start subsidizing students for transportation, but I don't do it for our other 200 employees, right? How does that look, right? So
Yeah.
that's the challenge as an employer. But could an employer talk to the government about, as an example, in University Park on our street, we have no sidewalks whatsoever. Therefore, Pace Bus cannot put a bus stop because we have nowhere for people to safely walk based on Pace's standard.
Yeah, that's
so those are the type of conversations that I think we could have with employers, is helping them be an advocate for transportation in general, not just for the student work-based learning. Because I think the reason why employers don't engage students as much is as we've talked, is a different barrier
Yeah.
other than transportation. But asking for their advocacy in transportation would help work-based learning and the rest of their employee
Yeah.
base.
Yeah, that Pace Bus example is a really helpful example. I'm definitely keeping that one in mind. Thank you for that. So another question that I have, and I think that kind of what you said already spoke to this a little bit, is what areas do you think there's kind of similarity and crossover when it comes to transportation for in-school youth versus adults and those who are out of school? And what do you think, I mean, obviously is different. So like the school-based provided the school district transportation is kind of the most glaring, but are there any other pieces that you think are similar and different for these various populations? Especially the private side. Yeah, I think something that was glaring to me as I was pulling all of this together, I wrote our memo, but just in another format, was really how much when it comes to the private transportation, that cost piece of, is it worth the cost of, a vehicle, gas, insurance, fares every day to and from, right? That can add up. Will folks who have transportation access barriers view all of that cost as worth it when they consider what their perceived benefit of participating in these opportunities is? And I think that's pretty challenging. And I think that is something that I agree. I think when it comes to out of school youth or adults, that cost benefit dilemma, especially, I feel like, especially with adults, right? Or out of school youth, if they also have, their own life responsibilities and they have to, they have families to support. That's another huge factor, right? If they're spending a bunch of their time on public transportation going to and from, and they could be working somewhere else, right, in their community, making money in that time that they are on transportation, you can see why that would be a dilemma for some people. Does anyone know of any? Yes, I agree, Craig. That is, does anyone have any knowledge of innovative collaboration that's going on in local communities, or any sort of creative work that people are doing? All right. Then I have a little bit more, but not too much before we wrap up. So as I've mentioned a few times, the work for this group is not fully complete. We're wrapping up, but we have a few more things we plan to do. So this graphic that I showed you earlier, right, we have a few more boxes in the new year. So this is a work group that will conclude. It's not going to be an ongoing work group. But we had originally planned to finish up our work, in December at the end of the year. And then we just had a few more things that we felt like we needed to dive into a little bit deeper. So we're conducting a student survey. So this was inspired because we had a couple of our staff members who went to a conference where they were talking with some students. And some of them were talking about, how they're able to figure out how to get around outside of school time. But sometimes, there are different during school, it's, the transportation situation is different. Or again, maybe it's related to that cost benefit dilemma. So we are planning to conduct a survey to ask the folks, right? We're focused on in-school youth. So let's get some feedback from them. Let's find out how they get around. Let's find out how they get to school. Some of the, if providing their own transportation to work-based learning has dissuaded them from participating in work-based learning before, those types of things. And then we're going to have another meeting, wrap up the conversation on potential solutions with our work group. We have some questions specifically we want to ask them. I believe I have a next slide that shows you what some of those questions are. And then in the spring, we want to kind of put forth a second memo detailing the rest of this work before we wrap up completely. And then also just kind of the ongoing piece may be a little bit coordinating with some of those other groups that are also talking about transportation. So, you know, I specifically mentioned the IWIB group that's going to be working on transportation for sort of that out of school youth component. So like I said, we have some lingering questions that we're going to bring to our work group about solutions. So more, and I know, Craig, I took notes on what you were talking about already, but more conversations about what roles can employers play. I think that Pace Bus example is really good. I'm probably going to bring that to our group. And then what models are there of ways that funding can be used creatively? Are there any systematic ways to increase things like number of drivers that have the credentials? Are there any other questions that you all think we should be asking as we talk about solutions? All right. Well, if there are, and you think of them later on, or you just want to throw them in the chat, feel free to do so. That kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. So something that we like to utilize a lot just to kind of see, you know, what you can take away from this with you into some of the work you may be doing, you know, after this presentation is just kind of taking note of anything that maybe is sticking with you that connects to other work or thoughts you may have been having, or if there's just an important point that really sticks with you, kind of reflecting on it, taking note of that. We also have, and this is a shameless plug here, we have our Success Network conference coming up in February. So this is going to be with a theme of awareness to action, promoting equity in education and careers. Again, this is going to be, it's, you know, hosted by the Success Network, but it's inclusive of, you know, folks all across the P20 pipeline that are going to be attending this. It is going to be February 29th. It is going to be at Moraine Valley Community College. And the registration is open and linked. It's linked in the slides. I can also send the link in the chat, but we encourage you, if you are available, to save the date and attend the conference. We have a really good wide array of sessions that we'll be having. And I think that you can actually see the agenda and some more information about what sessions we'll be having on the website. So you should be able to find that information as well if you want to take a look at the agenda. And that is all for me. Thank you for taking the time to join this conversation today. I hope that you found it helpful. It was really neat for me to be able to share this work that we've been really spending a lot of time on the last several months with all of you. And I look forward to kind of sharing the final pieces of our work. So I will stop the share. I will throw a few things. I paused it. How do I stop it? Stop share. I will throw my email and the link for the Success Network conference in the chat. If you have other thoughts that come up later on about transportation, like I said, any questions we should be asking, any people you think we should engage, any of that kind of stuff, feel free to email me. Oh, I sent that as a direct message. Let's try this again.
And while Laura's doing that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and listening to Ed Systems work that they've been doing. I'm excited to hear that they're going to continue to do a little bit of work before they wrap up the work group. I think Laura can take some of the comments that she got today back to the work group, which I think will be really relative. And yes, thank you, Laura, for putting those links in the chat. And then just to reiterate that this webinar was recorded. So if there's anyone in your organizations or in your offices that you would like to send it to so they can be aware of the work that EdSystem has been doing, they can send the recording, or you can send the recording to them, and you will have that hyperlink in your follow-up email tomorrow at 10 a.m. And then we do encourage your participation on the follow-up survey as well. We do look at those. I personally look at those and compile the data from the follow-up surveys and present them to the WIO Professional Development Committee. So that way you, if there's, look, we can gauge your feedback on the sessions to make sure that we're not missing the mark on the professional development we're providing you, as well as any new professional development topic areas that you would want the WIO Professional Development Committee to explore. We are always open for that. We are currently planning through June of 2024. Every single Wednesday at 10 a.m. and even some Wednesdays at 1 p.m. we have professional development sessions. So we have a lot of open slots. Or if you yourself would like to submit a request for presentation on a Workforce Wednesday webinar, we do have a form on our website as well, so you can browse that. And then thank you so much, Laura, for your time today. I appreciate you volunteering, or I guess me asking you and you volunteering willingly to present not only this webinar, but Laura did a previous one for us back in October, I think. And you can get on our website and listen to that as well if you're interested. Okay, I think that's it. We'll wrap us up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you again, Laura.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.